Today is the 2nd of June, 2015. The topic is, why did Jimmy Carter lose his re-election bid in November of 1980? My guest is Dave DeWitt, co-editor of the Athens News. I am Robert Whaley, retired historian at Ohio University, and this is the Athens Speakout number 333. By August of 1980, Carter's polls were going down. Carter was being challenged by Ronald Reagan in November for Carter's re-election, November of 1980. I voted for Carter twice, in 1976 and in 1980, as the best peace candidate. I assumed that most thinking Americans had learned something about the losses of American troops in Vietnam, and that Carter would win re-election. I assumed that the voters had enough of the prospect of another losing war in a remote, underdeveloped area such as Pakistan. I had no idea how the masses of voters believed the lies of the CIA and the latest TV star, Ted Koppel, who was undermining the credibility of Jimmy Carter. Koppel was very subtle in convincing public opinion, particularly Jewish liberal opinion, that Carter was an appeaser and rather weak as a president. I did not hold that opinion. I was not convinced. And I was an exception. I was a minority among the faculty and the students. But of course, I had a kind of historical depth that they lacked. The majority of Jews still voted against Ronald Reagan, the governor of California, and 60% of the Jews gave their vote to Jimmy Carter in November of 1980. But it was a 20% drop compared to Hubert Humphrey. And that was not sufficient to put the Democratic candidate over the top. So we made a second point last time that the CIA director, Admiral Stansfield Turner, was a Democrat, while the other 10 directors of the CIA were Republicans appointed from within inside the agency. And the third point we made was the suspicions raised by an unknown operative by the name of Gary Sick, who was an assistant of Zbigniew Brzezinski and wrote 2 suggestive books on the CIA and Zbigniew Brzezinski, suggesting, but not proving, that Carter's administration might have been sabotaged by some kind of inside conspiracy. The second book was called The October Surprise, but the first book was even more vague, and its title was All Fall Down, and it was published in 1981. And the second book got more to the point, published 10 years later in 1991. So I'm going to go back to that problem. The first question is, how did Gary Sick make these suggestions that the CIA may have plotted the sabotage of Carter's chances to be reelected? Do you have a little wrap-up? We hadn't quite finished all of that
Well, yeah.
complex discussion.
What we had discussed was Stansfield Turner, when he came in, he wanted to overhaul the way that the CIA does its operations, and he specifically got rid of a lot of the clandestine operations that the CIA had done in what was known as the Halloween Massacre, where he cut it, I think, 80% of clandestine.
Now, was the Halloween Massacre, did that refer to the October surprise? Is that
No, I think that was separate. That was just...
that's another Halloween. That's
yeah.
another October.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
That was just his dismantling of the clandestine services and overhauling the way
Why
that
did
the
you name
CIA...
it Halloween Massacre?
I think it must have taken place on Halloween when all these people were fired.
Well, it might have been after the October surprise.
Well, the October surprise was...
October. That's definitely October 1980.
Right. Yeah, and Turner did his
And that
cuts
was
to the CIA long before that.
That's Gary Sick's suggestion. See?
Right, and which is what I'm about to get into. So the idea is that there's a lot of resentment in the CIA because of what Turner and Carter did to the CIA operations.
Right.
And that resentment led to them, according to Gary Sick's accusations, coordinating with William J. Casey, who was campaign manager for Ronald Reagan in 1980 and ended up becoming Ronald Reagan's CIA director from 1981 to 1987.
Wow.
So this is Gary Sick's accusation against Mr. Casey. He says, and the criticism against Sick's accusations are that they're all circumstantial. There's no smoking gun. It's a lot of circumstantial evidence. But so he accuses Casey of going to two Iranian-born wheeler dealers, basically, is what I have here.
Smugglers. They were in the business of smuggling secondhand arms.
Jamshid and Cyrus Hashimi.
Yeah.
Yeah. Who had ties to the Khomeini regime, which had just taken over in Iran.
Right.
The Ayatollah Khomeini during the Iranian Revolution. And the Hashimis purportedly arranged for Casey to attend two meetings in Madrid in the summer of 1980 with Medai Karoubi. I'm sorry if I get any of these names wrong. An Iranian cleric close to the Ayatollah. According to Sick, Casey subsequently had one last meeting in Paris about 2 weeks before the election to clinch the deal to wait to release the hostages until after Reagan had been elected, which ended up happening once Reagan was elected. 20 minutes, actually, after his inaugural address, the hostages were released. The other thing that I wanted to mention is that apparently Reagan's own poll taker had Carter leading 41% to 39% as late as mid-October, and Sick accuses Casey of being very surprised that Carter would pull off an October surprise and release the hostages, and that's where the name the October surprise conspiracy comes from.
Very good. I think you've kind of more or less hit the high spots.
Yeah.
The only thing I can do at this point is go back to this earlier book, the more suggestive book, called All Fall Down, published in 1981, when Sick only had suspicions. And he didn't have any of this evidence of what Casey was doing. He was remote from the inside CIA, you see. So Sick's original argument was that you compare the big Iranian state with the small number of people in the CIA, and you compare that to Chiang Kai-shek's big China. And in 1927, Chiang Kai-shek won a smashing victory against the communists in China, but then Chiang Kai-shek's regime was defeated by the Japanese army, and in the last phase of the Chinese Revolution, Mao Zedong was able to win in 1949, and China collapsed in 49, And Dean Acheson was then the Secretary of State of the United States, and he defended the Truman administration and the Roosevelt administration by saying that China was simply too big, and the United States aide, Chiang Kai-shek, could never have frustrated Chinese communist victory under Mao Zedong, because he won the loyalty of the peasants, the majority of the people, and Chiang Kai-shek had confined himself to the gentry class, the large landlords, so that Mao's victory in 1949 was inevitable because of the history of China. So that's what Gary Sick uses, a kind of an analogy. He was saying no matter what the Ayatollah did, no matter what Carter did, no matter what the CIA did, Iran was too big, and once the revolution broke out, the American foreign policy was uninformed of the internal politics of Iran. That's the theory of they all fall down. The State Department was uninformed, Carter was uninformed, the CIA was uninformed, and it was just a tragedy of errors. Now, I read a book review of this All Fall Down, written by a very famous political scientist by the name of Stanley Huffman, who did the book review in 1981 when Gary Sick first published that. So I used Huffman's analysis of this book, and Huffman gives Gary Sick high marks, okay, that the Iranian Revolution of '79 followed the same kind of a pattern as the Russian Revolution of 1917 and the French Revolution of 1789. And once a revolution, a social revolution, breaks out, foreign intervention by a few elitists cannot change the course of that revolution. So they all fell down. The Shah fell down. Richard Nixon fell down, Jimmy Carter fell down, Zbigniew Brzezinski fell down, Cyrus Vance fell down, Savick failed and fell down, the Polish Pope fell down, and the State Department fell down, and there was nothing that any American could have done to have change the course of the Iranian Revolution. Okay, the cards had already been loaded back in 1973 when Eisenhower had overthrown Mossadegh, a nationalist, and now the nationalists were coming back, and they could see the United States and the British as instruments of oil imperialism. So that was the social economic thesis of Gary Sick, a rather sophisticated thing. That's the charge of that book. Now, Zabrinsky's failure was a little bit larger. He failed to understand this dynamics of the Iranian Revolution. And the Shah failed in informing the Carter administration that he had cancer. And they didn't have time to find any alternative candidate to manipulate.
So the Shah wasn't able, he wasn't at full strength to fight his...
Well, see, he resigned and left. He was in exile.
Right.
And then the Ayatollah came back, and then all of the student radicals said the Ayatollah is our hero. And he's talking about the United States as the great Satan. So the Ayatollah has a coalition of both conservative Muslims and radical quasi-socialist nationalists who see the Ayatollah as an alternative to the Shah, who was regarded as a puppet of oil imperialists.
Yeah.
That's the dynamics of this revolution. It was a rather complex affair. In other words, you just can't find the conspirator. That's a kind of a oversimplified view that Zabriskie had. If you can find out where the communists are, you can stop it. Well, how are you going to find the communists?
Yeah.
In a country of 39 million people.
Right.
So that's Zabriskie's failure. His failure to understand Iranian history. And that's been a failure of conservatives traditionally. During the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, the Chinese Revolution, the conservatives are just blind to the idea of reform and liberalism. And if the liberals and reformists fail, and you keep a lid on the tea kettle, it's going to explode in a revolution. Mm-hmm. And that's the tragedy of American conservatives, I think. That's my thesis, and that's Gary Sick's thesis, and I guess that's Dean Aches's thesis. We are all liberals.
Fair enough.
Okay.
So the Shah had cancer.
Yes, and he had to resign. And it was Henry Kissinger, by the way, who says, okay, Shah, come to Egypt and I can get you medical attention, and then you can have medical attention in the United States. So he prolonged the life of the Shah. Mm-hmm. But that creates suspicion in Iran. Mm-hmm. They're using this idea of monarchy to bring back some legitimate monarchists. Mm-hmm. And that's why they became hostile to this salvation of the Shah.
I see.
Just as in the French Revolution, it was the Holy Roman Empire tried to save the monarchists in France, and then that led to a long war. And it was Chiang Kai-shek and the American business interests that saved Chiang from possible revolution. Instead of preventing the revolution, it stimulates it, because the revolutionaries are able to synthesize both nationalism and social protest. Mm-hmm. In other words, the Reds won the revolution in 1917 because the Reds were patriotic. Right. And the whites were poisoned with foreign intervention. Chiang Kai-shek was poisoned with American intervention and Japanese intervention. So the communists said, well, Chiang is a puppet of Japan, and now he's a puppet of the United States. Get rid of puppets and have a pure Chinese revolutionary. That's how nationalism and revolution are important, to see that. So, yes, that's the, and of course now Nixon's failure was from 1968 to 73, they just gave the Shah and the Soviet a blank check, send all the weapons they need, and that's a area of stability, and they didn't anticipate any revolution. The Shah is going to live forever. And then if he dies, his son will take over. That's the theory of the conservatives. You don't have to worry. Now, Carter's failure was that he, too, was not a historian. He was only the governor of Georgia, and he had an insight into the Arab-Israeli crisis as a Christian, but he had no idea how complex the Islamic world is. That's the problem of Carter.
Another way that I look at it was he was an engineer, right? He was
a
scientist.
He was educated in Annapolis as a nuclear engineer.
Engineers tend to want everything to fit together.
That's right, simplistic.
And everything has, a connection to this and that, and that's how it all works together. And I don't think that's exactly how politics works.
That's true. Now, Jimmy Carter has learned in his retirement and has written dozens of books in which he has learned the history of the Middle East and the history of the Republican Party. So he's become an elder statesman, sort of like John Quincy Adams in retirement, after he went back to the House of Representatives. So Emory University has set up an international institute, and Carter has occasionally given some good advice to Clinton, and he has good relations with the blacks in the United States.
He seems to become liberals in general. He's got a pretty good...
liberals in the South, yes.
Yeah.
Jews are suspicious. That's the Koppel thesis.
Well, as you talked about back in the 70s, where the neoconservatives
the neoconservatives have no faith in Southern Christians. And so we have today, and the importance of that is, we have three very separate civilizations: Islamic civilization, Christian civilization, and Jewish civilization. And it's too simple to just dismiss the other. These three civilizations are going to be in conflict for some years.
And sure.
They have to re-educate themselves.
And there's conflict within the...
And this, yes, right.
Muslim world, for instance, the conflict between Sunnis and Shia.
Right.
Between Persia and Mecca.
Right. And the Bible is a much more complex document than the Quran. And Islam has the advantage of simplicity. It's very simple. Christians have been debating for 2,000 years what is the right way to interpret the words of Jesus Christ and Paul and so forth and so on. So that's the problem with that. Religion and philosophy have to be understood. And Carter had a biblical background, but didn't have much philosophy before he went to Annapolis. That was his academic weakness.
Yeah.
But he's learned that on the job. I heard Carter give an address. I went down to Emory University, and it was an address of all academics. This was put on by there were about 2,000 historians there, and Carter spoke about the need for nuclear disarmament. Mm-hmm. And he got a cheer, a big cheer. He said, if Carter had said that when he was president, I would have voted for him. But Carter had to be limited. He couldn't come out foursquare and say nuclear disarmament. Kind of suggested it and hoped that he could negotiate SALT II, but that failed. And when that failed, he lost the media then, you see. Anyway, that's I'm getting off the review of Hoffman. Do you want to say anything more about Hoffman and his analysis of the failures?
No, I think we've covered Gary Sick pretty well.
All right. Well, now there was a second review of Gary Sick's All Fall Down. See, Hoffman did the review for the New York Times. That was the major review. The second review was written for Foreign Affairs magazine. And it was written by Gaddis Smith. Gaddis Smith was a diplomatic historian in the tradition of our own John Gaddis. And he had written about Dean Acheson before. And he gave Carter all Fall Down a favorable review, and more or less endorses Hoffman's analysis that it was the pattern revolution in Russia, Yugoslavia, Cuba, and China that Carter was just caught in this pattern of revolution, and it was inevitable. Now, the third review was written by Daniel Pipes. Mm-hmm. He is a neocon. And his review was written in New Republic.
Oh, really?
Yeah, a Jewish liberal organ. And he follows the theses of Walter Lippmann and the Cold War. And Daniel Pipes is one of those Jews who, as a neoconservative, asked, well, is it good for American Jews? And then all other things follow in that pattern. So Pipes then gives good marks to Ted Koppel. So it's an emotional response. And he backs the Operation Cyclone. And then he takes up Time magazine and blames Carter for spending too much time on the 52 hostages. It's a kind of a ex post facto sneer. He gives Carter a kind of a weak president thesis. Well, that's the point of view of the neoconservatives, and I think that has to be debated, whether you agree with it or not. And I think you've covered the October surprise fairly well, and I don't think I have too much to add there, except to say that I did I looked at the New York Times review of that, and that was written by Joseph Persico.
Mm-hmm.
Did you see that one?
Yeah, I've read that before.
Yeah, that's so. I guess we got the information from the same source, and they go into this conspiracy theory of these Iranian brothers.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess I don't have anything to add. But you've got the names, the places, and the dates. And you've mentioned this 41% vote that Carter had. And Ronald Reagan had 39% of the voters. He was 2 points behind in October.
Mm-hmm.
Those were the statistics
from Reagan's internal polling. Yeah.
Right.
So they were worried.
Right. So in the end, the October surprise only had circumstantial evidence because not enough witnesses came forward to back up these stories of the Madrid meetings and the Paris meetings.
Right.
Because that's where the CIA has an advantage. If those Frenchmen stick their neck out and testify, there's a difference between an American court and in Paris and so forth.
Yes.
So you're not going to stick your neck out to support some conspiracy in some foreign country.
Sure.
So these guys weren't going to become a strange suicide, and there have been 25 or 30 of those.
Right.
So anyway, I guess I don't have anything more to that. Now, there's a second review that goes into this conspiracy theory, published in 2011.
Oh, I didn't see this one.
It's written by Robert Parry. He's a left-wing blogger like Snowden. He's similar to Glenn, and he is willing to, back this October surprise in great depth.
Mm-hmm.
And he brings a few more circumstantial evidence. Now, Perry has interviewed, after 2011, a lot of low-level agents inside the agency. And what I learned from the Perry report was that the 6th floor of Langley is only staffed by Republicans, and the 7th floor is only staffed by Democrats. And there's an open discussion among these low-level people in the CIA in campaigning amongst themselves. And these guys all become leakers. They're the guys who go to left-wing journalists and give these clues.
Really?
Yeah. In other words, there's an internal debate inside the CIA.
Sure. I guess that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting because Perry has testimony from, well, he doesn't give any names. He just says, I know an agent on the 6th floor who told me this while I was on Reagan. So it's based on gossip, really. And, of course, he has the easiest problem to substantiate that. So you can get a blog by Robert Perry, and it's way on the left. You can get read his supported news?
Yeah.
Yeah, he writes about the Middle East, about this brewing war in Ukraine and Russia and so forth. and he is very suspicious of the New York. He's left the New York Times. That's the point of Robert Perry.
Okay, yeah.
He's going to say things that
yeah.
anonymous sources.
Yeah.
Well, I found it very amusing. So in the end, then, the problem today is we have 4 potential medium-sized powers in the Middle East: the Turks, the Egyptians, the Saudis, and the Iranians. Cairo, Ankara, Tehran, and Islamabad are potential great powers, and Syria and Jordan and Afghanistan and Lebanon are just caught in these rival Muslim governments and the oil power. So the situation in the future for the United States' control of the Middle East is very dim. One other source I came across, part of Gary Sick's charges, is a journalist by the name of Brian Michael Till. Have you heard of him?
No.
Well, here's another guy his title is Conversations with Power. He's one of these guys who is trying to tap into the Gary Sick suspicion thesis. Okay, well, these are the sources. And then, of course, there's the importance of the money. What was being negotiated by Carter and Casey on the other side was these $12 billion assets frozen in the United States by the Carter administration and the Chase Bank. And those $12 billion are still being argued today. That hasn't changed.
Yeah.
The Iranians saying, we want the money and then we'll take care of the bombs.
The sanctions are still in place, and that's part of the big negotiations that continue right now.
There are leaks now with Perry and so on whether how Obama is going to fall out between now and the 2016 election. So the fat is in the fire, as they say.
Fall out. That's interesting. There's not a lot of good choices over in the Middle East, and there hasn't been good choices.
That's true.
And the choices seem to be getting worse.
Correct. Well, one of the charges of Perry is that Jimmy Carter had an exchange in October of 1980. And he was trying to negotiate with the Iranian Air Force. And they get into this. This Iranian guy alleges that the naval helicopters were sabotaged, you see. So these are one of the other speculative sources in the wind. Okay. So anyway, talk is cheap, I guess. I don't believe everything Perry is saying, but he's certainly important to keep following in the future. Then another one that's quoted is Douglas Brinkley.
Oh, the historian.
Yes, he's the son of the famous David Brinkley.
Yes.
Right.
And Douglas has done some pretty good work himself.
Yeah, now Douglas, Douglas Brinkley was interviewed on this Sick affair by Perry. And he kind of substantiates the Gary Sick thesis. But not yet attributed with any documents. He's not a friend of the Casey Reagan group.
No, he wouldn't be.
But of course, he's an old New Dealer.
Yeah. Yeah, David and Douglas was part of the new left of the counterculture 60s.
Right. Well, I want to say one thing more about Gaddis Smith, after he did this article, he wrote a brand new biography published in 1990 on the Carter administration. It's called Morality, Reason, Power, American Diplomacy in the Carter administration. I would like to read that book.
Yeah.
But I haven't got around to it. Of course, Gaddis Smith is now retired. He's of John Gaddis's administration age. I'm probably a little bit older than Gaddis Smith. He got his degree at Yale, and he taught at Yale. So he's got established credentials. But these credentials are all footnoted, and he's just a little bit cautious in defending Carter. And I don't think I doubt if he has any CIA insight. That's too adventuresome.
Shall we take a station break?
Yes, you didn't remind us. Oh, you saw Lois. Well, that's good, yes. Lois is supposed to warn us that we should stop talking for a while and introduce ourselves. My name is Robert Whaley, retired historian, and we're wrapping up the Carter failure in the Middle East and Ronald Reagan's election in 1980. And we're discussing this with David DeWitt, who is a journalist for the Athens News. So we'll get to the second key question here. How did the Carter election campaign of 1980 work out? What were the results of the primary?
Not well. Well, he was able to stave off a challenge from Ted Kennedy.
Right.
In the primary, although it was a contentious primary. It was hard fought. It led to a very scrappy national convention. These days, our conventions are pretty well determined before they ever even happen.
That's right.
Back then, that wasn't the case exactly.
Right.
So there was a lot of fighting at conventions, political fighting, and that one was one of the nastiest.
Well, I think it was rather peaceful compared to the 1968 Chicago Convention.
Oh, well, certainly, yeah. I was talking about the political fighting inside, not what was going on the streets outside. 68 definitely takes the cake for that. But
well, why did Ted Kennedy challenge this incumbent president, Jimmy Carter?
Well,
that was a kind of a surprise, wasn't it?
I think it was. Yeah, I think there was a building challenge on the left. I mean, people had wanted Kennedy to run in 72
Which
and
people?
in 70. Well,
wait a minute.
Some people.
Well, see, that's the problem. To get elected, there is a Kennedy faction and there's a Carter faction.
Right.
So how did Kennedy decide that he could defeat Carter in the primary?
I can only assume it must have been polling.
Polling? Well...
what I've read about it is that he consulted with his extended family. He kind of let it leak that he was considering a challenge to Carter to see how that played.
Okay.
And then when he got the results and they were positive and he saw that he did have support, he decided to go forward with the challenge.
Yeah, well, I have a slightly different interpretation of that. I was never a fan of the Kennedy dynasty, who were created as TV stars. That goes back to John, Robert, and Teddy, all three. Without TV, that dynasty would have never succeeded.
Well, yeah, the 1960 debate, the people who listened to it on the radio thought Nixon won it, and then the people who watched it on TV thought John Kennedy won.
Right. And this gets into the importance of religion again. There were deep religious wars in Europe between 1517 and 1648. And old man Kennedy, Joseph Kennedy, was the father of Joseph Jr., who died in World War II, and then he got John to run for president. And then when John was out, he got Robert to go, and then finally Ted. It was Joseph Kennedy's ambition to elect the first Catholic president of the United States, because Boston was settled by the Irish Catholic, and Al Smith had tried this in 1928, and the Catholic candidate was a wipeout.
Yeah. And so even for Kennedy, it was very tough.
And the 60 election was close.
Yeah. Well, it was Protestant West Virginia who
That's right.
ended up throwing it to him, and a lot of that could have had to do with the work of organized crime.
And money.
Yeah.
Joe Kennedy's money.
Which, a lot of it came from organized crime.
Yeah, I followed that primary. See, I was 30 years old then. And the rumors, you got. First of all, Eleanor Roosevelt supported Hubert Humphrey.
Oh, okay, yeah.
She did not like the Kennedy dynasty.
No,
it goes back to Joe Kennedy. Do you know his relationship with Franklin?
Well, he was a non-interventionist ambassador to England at the beginning of the Second World War.
Right, he was an isolationist.
He was an isolationist.
The isolationists were in the saddle.
He did not want the United States to go to war.
It was Roosevelt who was just gradually intervening. Because after the First World War, 90% of the American people said never again. And isolationism was strong. Woodrow Wilson was repudiated. So we had Coolidge, we had Harding, we had Hoover, and even Franklin Roosevelt in 1932 said nothing about foreign affairs.
Well, yeah, and I think he was running as a peace candidate.
Well, no, not a peace candidate. The depression, unemployment.
Oh, yeah, he was focused on that in his first elections, but I think even as late as the 1940 campaign.
Well, now that's getting into intervention.
Yeah.
Okay, let's get back to Joe Kennedy and Franklin Roosevelt. Roosevelt decided in September of 1937 that there would be another European war. England would have to fight Germany. England and France would fight Germany. And just as in World War I, the United States sooner or later will get into it. And he gave a very significant speech in September of 1937. And he gave it in Chicago.
Oh, yeah.
And he gave it with the Chicago Tribune. And his speech was very clever. It said, I hate war and I don't want war, but we are going to have to quarantine the aggressors. Now, he didn't name the aggressors. But if you read the newspaper, there were three aggressors. Mussolini in Italy, Hitler in Germany, and the Japanese Empire in China. Well, anyway, Congress reacted the next day, and the Chicago Tribune and the Hearst Press, they all denounced the speech. And Roosevelt backed off. Roosevelt had a baby public opinion, and he didn't say anything about intervention until July of '38. And his rearmament program was very, very cautious, because this problem of isolationism is confused. The Democrats were isolationist toward Far East and interventionist in Europe. And the Republicans were the opposite side of the X. They were interventionists in the Far East, from Teddy Roosevelt, the China market, and all of this.
Sure.
And they wanted to be peaceful toward Europe, appeased toward Europe. Now, Roosevelt played both sides against the middle.
Sounds like Roosevelt.
And then in July of 1938, the Japanese move into the British concessions in China. And then he announces, well, we're going to have to rearm the American Air Force and the American Navy and so forth and so on. And we're going to protect the American Marines. The American Marines were stationed in China We're going to have to protect the American when those Japanese come. Because Shanghai, Fuzhou, there were 5 treaty ports. And it was inevitable that the Japanese were going to move down the whole coast of China and maybe even move into Hong Kong. And the Philippine Islands were out there. And General MacArthur went out there, a big Republican. He used to be the commander-in-chief of the American Armed Forces under Hoover. And when Roosevelt came in, he volunteers to be the commander-in-chief of the independent Philippine Army. And the Philippines were promised independence in 1946. Well, when Pearl Harbor hit, the Japanese bombed Manila. So MacArthur was already anticipating a Far East war, and so was the American Navy. They were all ready to go. Since 1922, the American Navy was saying, well, the next war is going to be with the Japanese Navy. So,
Roosevelt
was playing both
Kennedy.
Sides against the middle. Oh, now Kennedy. Now, Kennedy.
We got to get back to the 1980 election.
All right. In 1934, Roosevelt appoints Joe Kennedy as a millionaire in charge of the Security Exchange Commission. And that is a commission to inspect to see if there aren't any watered stocks down. Okay, and Joe Kennedy had made money in Hollywood and made money in the whiskey business. So he was a rich millionaire. And he was going to use these millions to subsidize his sons to undo the Al Smith defeat, see? So, in 1938, Roosevelt's pet ambassador in London died. And Roosevelt then says, okay, Joe, why don't you become the ambassador to England? And then I can tell everybody, I'm not an interventionist. We're not going to have war. I got one of the most leading isolationist countries in England. And you can be the ambassador. But what he didn't tell Joe Kennedy is that he had a secret correspondence with Winston Churchill through the Navy, okay? And then he had intelligence spies watching Joe Kennedy. And Joe Kennedy stuck his neck out. After the British got in the war in 1939, Joe Kennedy was saying, well, the Germans have the best air force, the Germans are going to win, the British are done, forget about it. Well, Roosevelt was documenting all of that. At a certain point, he calls Joe Kennedy back to Washington, and he says, "What are you doing with these reports, demoralizing the British? I want you to resign, and I never want to see you again in this office." That was the end of Joe Kennedy's ambition.
Sure.
And that's why he sent his son after the war broke out. After the Americans got into the war, he said, you know, you got to be a military man and prove that you're a patriot.
Yeah.
And then John went into the Navy.
Yeah.
And so he had to have a war hero if they were going to be elected in Massachusetts. And then John repudiated this appeasement and his father and wrote a book about the Munich thing. Now, some people say that book was forged by somebody.
Ghostwritten.
It was written by somebody at Harvard.
A lot of books by politicians are
Well, he wrote a book called While England Slept, which completely repudiates Old Man Joe. Okay. So, I wanted to get into the dynasty.
Right.
And how this percolates into World War II and how Joe led...
So Kennedy gets elected in 1960.
Wait a minute, before 60. How did he get elected in Massachusetts? When did he get elected and how?
Well,
1952, he runs the Senate. Before that, he had to go to the House of Representatives as a war hero.
Right.
PT 109 got him elected.
Yeah.
And he was a Catholic, devout anti-communist when he got elected as senator. He was not the liberal that...
yeah, I know. I trust me, I don't conceive of John Kennedy as much of a liberal.
The liberal came later.
Yeah.
He was kind of...
Bobby was more of a liberal
well, he was the younger boy.
Was.
Yeah, he was the younger boy, and he could see the handwriting on the wall. Okay.
Yeah.
But John then in 52, got elected when Eisenhower was elected. And he was anti-communist on the Korean War and so forth and so on. And he was an anti-communist Catholic, okay?
He played the anti-communist card to the hilt.
Right. Now, in 1960, he had to beat Kennedy Hubert Humphrey in the primary. And he did. And getting back to that West Virginia vote, Joe Kennedy had the money. The mafia, helped get it elected. But they also went around and gave hams and bottles of whiskey at every county dinner and so forth and so on. And it was clear, from the point of view of Hubert Humphrey, that he was going to lose through the old machine, see.
He was being outbought.
Yeah. So, and Hubert Humphrey was defeated because it wasn't a Catholic-Protestant fight. It was a crisscross between the Massachusetts machine and the rather weak Midwest machine of Minnesota. It was Massachusetts outspent Minnesota. That's what it amounts to. But Hubert Humphrey was more liberal on civil rights than John was.
Sure.
Minneapolis was a much liberal state than Boston was. And then when Martin Luther King came out, they challenged Kennedy when Kennedy was president.
Yeah.
Are you going to defend Martin Luther King? And then Kennedy began to move to the left because that's where the votes were. So he becomes a civil rights advocate. And then when he was assassinated, it's Johnson who picks up that ball and gets Kennedy's...
He gets the Civil Rights Act passed, he gets the Voting Rights Act passed.
Right. So the black-white confrontation crisscrosses with the Massachusetts Midwest conflict, and then that's how politics is complex, is what I'm saying.
And then the Republicans launched their Southern strategy.
Right.
Shore up the racist vote in the South. So
anyway,
Ted Kennedy versus Jimmy Carter in 1980. What do you conceive of as who's supporting each side?
Oh, wait a minute now. Let's review the facts. John is assassinated at Dallas, November 1963.
Right.
John Kennedy, I become a real fan of John Kennedy in 1963 in August when he signs that disarmament treaty with McMillan and Khrushchev over the objections of the Hawks, okay? Now, some say that Kennedy was already thinking of getting out of Indochina.
Yeah,
That's
I think it's hard to make a conclusion about what Kennedy would have done in
let's
Vietnam.
Speculate. He is supposed to have said, after I get out, his office going to get reelected. After I get reelected, I'm going to reconsider this intervention of Eisenhower. But he had escalated the advisors over Eisenhower, you see.
Yeah.
So he's getting deeper.
He had been.
Yeah, but then.
But that doesn't mean that his mission creep would have gone all the way that it did with Johnson.
But anyway, he began to back off, and there was this assassination of Nodin Zim, and he did that through a Massachusetts senator. Okay, there was a Republican there, Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. And some say that there was a little plot there inside the State Department in Kennedy to get rid of Nodin Zim. But after they did, the new hunters, chaos. There was nobody to replace Nodin Zim. They got rid of a bad dictator. But see, this gets back to David Halberstam and all of the reports on how the Americans were losing in South Vietnam. So then they blamed the Nodin Zim family for the problem.
So either way, Kennedy ends up assassinated, and Johnson ends up going further and further
he got
into
in deeper. And then you
Vietnam.
See
and then Robert comes along as the anti-war challenge.
That's right.
And when he announces his candidacy,
you got it.
Johnson realizes, oh, wait, I don't think I can win this, and he pulls out. He withdraws.
Wait a minute. Wait a minute. Let's go back to February. In February, we only got 2 minutes. So we'll have to stop in February of 1968. But I want to mention that Robert was assassinated in California.
Right.
And then they went to the Chicago Convention.
Right, which is the convention we mentioned
well, we'll
earlier.
have to stop at that point. So do you want to summarize how we got up to the Kennedy dynasty? I want to emphasize this theme of the dynasty.
Well, we started with the Gary Sick and the Carter administration, and how Carter ended up losing the 1980 election to Reagan, and the conspiracy theory about the Reagan administration working with the Iranians to release the hostages. We covered all of that, and then we started going back to the Ted Kennedy challenge to Jimmy Carter and the Democratic National Convention primary of 1980.
Right.
And to build up to that point, we began discussing the Kennedy dynasty with the roots of Joe Kennedy as an ambassador to England in World War II, and his mission to install his Catholic sons as the first Catholic president of the United States.
And now the only thing I want to say about this thing is I want to say a little bit more how Ted Kennedy got involved in not getting in the race. After John was assassinated and then Robert, Ted was not going to run as president. Right. So his running for president in 1980 was a surprise to a lot of people. It was. And we'll have to continue that story next time.
Okay. Yeah. Got a lot of ground to cover.
Yeah, right.